In this video, we're going to show you how to install the exhaust and intake manifold hardware kit on your Jeep Wrangler, located on the top side of your engine. Remove the expansion tank from the front side of the radiator. We're going to use our pliers. I'm going to pinch the hose clamp here. I'm going to go ahead and just twist this off. Now the expansion tank, you just have to get underneath it and give it a quick jolt upwards to go ahead and release that. Good, pull that up and out and set that aside. Right down here behind the belt is the belt tensioner for the serpentine belt. We're going to use a 17mm socket and extension, and we're going to loosen that counterclockwise. Enough where we can take that serpentine belt off. I'm going to work that off the power steering pump. Now I want to go ahead and separate our power steering pump from the intake manifold. There's going to be 3 13mm bolts. There's one here, and then there's one on the bottom. And what you're going to do is you're going to rotate the pulley, because there's a hole or a couple of holes in the front of the pulley. That way you can go ahead and put your 13mm socket and ratchet into. I'm going to break these free, and then I'm going to use some power tools to go ahead and zip the rest of them out. And just pull those bolts out through the holes in the pulley. Make sure the bolt comes out with the washer. Now to leave everything else hooked up, we just want to go ahead and wiggle this off so we can go ahead and just kind of pull that aside like so. Use your flathead screwdriver. We're going to go ahead and loosen the clamps holding our intake in place. We're going to remove or loosen the clamp on the throttle body, and then over at the air filter box. Now we have to go ahead and remove this component here as well off of the intake. It's just a rubber hose. Just pop that off. Wiggle this off, and we'll pop that hose, set it aside. Now on the top side of the engine here, the next thing you want to do is grab a towel or rag, and you want to go ahead and plug up the throttle body here. We don't want to have anything fall down inside that. Protect the debris from falling in. Disconnect our throttle cable here. There's just a little ball-on socket. You can just pop that off. You can use a flathead screwdriver, a pair of pliers. Just pop that off like so. Now I want to disconnect this cable here. You can use a pair of pliers, but you just want to pinch these little tabs, pull that wire through. Pop this off of our retainer clips. Just tuck that off to the side. On the top here, we have a vacuum hose going into the intake. Lift that up, swing that off to the side, get that out of the way. Now the other things we want to disconnect are our wiring harnesses running to all of our components. We have our fuel injector harness here, so we want to pull up on this plastic housing, disconnecting that. These just press onto the cylinder head studs. Now on the injector connectors, you're just going to push in on these little tabs here, pinch and pull. I'm going to do this for all of the injector connectors. Along the front side here, we have our coolant temp sensor. Push in on the little tab on the top here, pinch and pull. I'm going to come right to the back side here. There's a whole series of connectors. Go ahead and separate those. And this should allow you to go ahead and pull this harness up and out of the way. Now remember that the harness runs down underneath the fuel rail here. And all of these connectors are specific to what they're plugging into. So when you reconnect everything, they are specific. So you're not going to mix anything up. It takes the confusion out of it. Toss that aside. On the back side right here, we have an O2 sensor connector that's actually pressed in using a little Christmas tree plastic retainer. You can use a trim tool to go ahead and pop that out. On this side over here to the right of the throttle body, right underneath, there's a vacuum hose going to this. Go ahead and pull that off. Just tuck that off to the side. We have a vacuum here to our brake booster. Pop that off. And then we have another vacuum hose on the back side here. Want to be careful with this one here. Now, next thing we have is our high pressure fuel line here for our fuel injection. Now, something like this here, you definitely want to wear safety glasses for. You want to go ahead and pop off our retainer or safety clip here. Now, we did spray this down with some rust penetrant to just kind of free some things up. This is our safety clip. We want to pop this off. Now we have our high pressure fuel line right here. We're going to use a high pressure fuel line disconnect tool to separate this from the fuel rail. Now you want to be careful on something like this here. You can have a residual amount of high pressure fuel in there. So wearing safety glasses and protecting this when it comes apart is key. Now here's the tool here. They come in various different designs, but what this does is it goes onto the fuel line and will press in. It will undo the internal retaining clip or the lock. You simply push this in, it'll disconnect it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a towel here. I'm going to cover the top here and basically just going to pull that off. And all I did was I pulled on this fuel line here and separated it. Now you may have some residual fuel left in there. Our particular vehicle hasn't been running in a little bit of time here, so we don't have a lot of fuel pressure here, but you may have a quick little psh, a little spray, and that's what you want to be careful of. Safety glasses, gloves are highly recommended, and cover that when you disconnect it. On the bottom side of the intake manifold, there is a 10 millimeter nut and bolt right on the bottom that's securing our fuel line. Now I'm going to use my ratchet and my shallow 10 millimeter socket to go ahead and loosen this. Now in our particular case, the nut and bolt are both spinning, so we're just going to put a wrench on the back side and hold the other side of it. We're using 3/8 socket and wrench on this here. Go ahead and remove the nut and bolt. Underneath the vehicle where our exhaust system attaches to the exhaust manifold is going to be two 17 millimeter bolts. So one on the bottom here facing forward, the one on the top is facing towards the back of the vehicle. So let's go ahead and put our socket and ratchet on there. We want to go ahead and loosen and remove this bolt. Now we did spray this down with a lot of rust penetrant. We let it soak. Sometimes you'll have to apply some heat. You'll have to apply some heat to these bolts to get them loose. Try not to break them off in the flange. Go ahead and remove that bolt. On the top side of the exhaust here, you can have another 17 millimeter bolt, and there's a 17 millimeter nut on the other side. On this one here, we actually have to use a deep socket and a ratchet over here to hold the nut. And this side here, we're going to use our ratchet to go ahead and loosen this. The lower one, we're able to unthread off of the nut, no problem. This side here, we'll have to hold that nut while we remove this bolt. And remove that nut and bolt. With the 2 bolts removed, we're just going to grab that exhaust, and we want to go ahead and try and separate that a little bit. There we go. And we just separate it from the exhaust manifold. Let's move back up top. Using our 14 millimeter gear wrench or regular wrench, you want to go ahead and loosen a series of these bolts across the top of the intake manifold. Now, we did go ahead and soak these in rust penetrant for quite a while now to go ahead and loosen these up. You want to prevent these from breaking off in the cylinder head. On this back bolt here, I was only able to get my open end wrench in there. We'll go ahead and spin that out now. On the very, very back side, on the back, there is another nut and stud unit. On our particular vehicle, the lower nut and stud appears to be a 13 millimeter, not a 14 like the uppers. And we have the nut a little bit loose here. We're gonna work that back and forth. There we go, remove the nut. Let's go ahead and remove the nut and washer from the front. Now our front one here is coming out with the stud as well as the nut with that washer. Let's go ahead and remove that and set that aside. Now underneath the exhaust manifold, you can see here, we want to go ahead and get to this 14 millimeter bolt. We have a couple extensions here. And the ratchet is up beside the intake manifold. Now there's one right by that ribbed portion of the exhaust, and there is a second one further back we need to get to next. Once we get this out, we'll go ahead and move to that rear bolt. We have that lower bolt out. The washer is still stuck down there, but we'll get that later on. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take you down below the exhaust or the intake area here. I'm going to squeeze us down inside. Now there's 2 bolts right there. There's one between the pipes, and then there's one further back over here. Those hold the manifold and intake together. So we're going to go ahead, loosen and remove those. On the front side, we removed the bolt up front here. We're going to come back and we're going to get that other one right up between those 2 down pipes there. So let's go ahead, loosen and remove that. I'll loosen and remove this here. You want to be careful as you're removing this here. The intake and exhaust manifold will be loose. spin that out and pull that bolt out. I'm going to use a rubber mallet here. I'm just going to tap the intake. And we're just separating this from the cylinder head. You can see the gap coming through here. Now the intake, I believe, has metal dowels or cast pins that line up the intake with the cylinder head. So I might take a little bit of effort of wiggling this. There we go. We get the front section, just kind of wobble it a little bit, work the back off, and there it is. Now there may be fuel left in your fuel rail, so don't pick this up and tip it towards you, because the fuel can come out there and it'll soak you. Lift that up nice and even, pull it away and set it aside. Now with the intake out of the way, we can now access the exhaust manifold. When we pulled our hardware out, we had a washer that's stuck on the back side here. You want to make sure that you collect all those washers, because you do have to reuse those. You also want to be careful not to damage that rear stud. All right, we got that other washer out there, so that's good. We'll set that aside. Now I just have to work this off the stud in the back. Here we go. Be careful of your sensors. And when we lift this up, I don't know if you can see this right here, there's a crack in the tube right here running down all the way around. So, reason why we have to replace this. We want to go ahead and collect the exhaust manifold and intake gasket. Ours was broken in two. Inspect it for any sort of leaks. And even though it was broken on the end here, that was where the bolt was. It wasn't interfering with sealing the two components. But we're going to be replacing that anyways, so go ahead and discard that. Now we need to get this stud out of the back of the cylinder head. Definitely soak it down in some rust penetrant. Sometimes you're going to need some heat on there to get that off. Now this is a good reason why you want to go ahead and replace these. The stud itself should be the same diameter from the threads all the way out to the end here where the threads are. Ours was so rusted that in the very middle it's beveled and rotted. So not too long in the near future, this stud would have snapped. It would no longer have been securing the manifolds together to the cylinder head. You would have ended up with an exhaust leak from the gasket on the back side of the engine. Before we clean up the surface here of the cylinder head, I want to go ahead and stuff some towels inside the ports themselves. And what this is going to do is this is going to help prevent any of the material that we clean out of here. It's going to prevent it from going into the engine. Next step, we want to go ahead and clean the side of our cylinder head here where the intake and exhaust is going to be mating up to. It's going to be a new gasket that goes in place here, so you want to make sure that that has a nice mating surface. Now this is a cast head, so we can go ahead and use a power tool and gently clean it. If this was aluminum, you'd be using some sandpaper and a wooden block to go ahead and scuff this and clean it that way there so you don't damage the head. Use some spray solvent. Go ahead and wipe this down. While you're doing this here, inspect it, make sure that there's no pieces of old gasket left, anything like that. Here we have two threaded studs here. One goes on the front, on the far front, and the other one goes on the far rear. Now on the front side here, we have an inverted Torx, and this is an E8. This fits onto the top here, and that's what we're going to use to thread this into the cylinder head. Before we thread in our studs or our bolts, I'm going to just use some compressed air and blow out the threaded holes. Kind of clean up the area. Now that we have that all set, we can go ahead and start to thread in one of the studs on the front side of the cylinder head. This unit right here will actually thread into the front portion right here, and then there's one that goes in the far back. So start to thread it in. That does have a Loctite on the threads. Now we're going to use an E8 inverted Torx socket to go ahead and tighten this down. And that goes on my 1/4 inch ratchet. And that will bottom out. Just snug it down into place. Don't over tighten it, but you do want it snug. Let's go ahead and do the same for the back port. It's way, way, way in the back here. Now at this point, it is safe to go ahead and pull all the towels out of the ports. So go ahead and do so. Once we have the paper towels out of our cylinder head, we want to pay attention to the downpipe on the exhaust. You want to inspect this portion right here. It's a flared section where the exhaust donut is going to fit from the exhaust manifold. Make sure this is clean of any debris, any deformities, anything like that, because the gasket needs to sit in here and make a tight seal. So definitely inspect this here because it makes it a lot harder to do once you have the exhaust manifold in place. Now before we install our gasket, you want to go ahead and make sure this is lined up properly. Now these ports here have certain notches in them, and they have to line up with the notches on the cylinder head. So go ahead, line up our gasket, slip it over the two studs on the ends, and that'll hold it in place. Next we'll install our exhaust manifold. Let's go ahead and lower our manifold down into place. Now the manifold has provisions for the two studs on the ends, so line that up. Work this down and into place. Now our downpipe here is kind of in the way, so we just want to push that down and out. Slide that on like so. Now at this point here, everything else should line up. Our gasket should line up perfect with the holes. What I'm going to do is I'm going to install the two nuts loosely on the studs. This is basically going to hold the manifold in place, but it'll give me a little bit of wiggle room to go ahead and adjust things as we go. Now right here we have one of the vacuum canisters, and there's two 3/8 bolts that secure it to the fender. Your vehicle might have three. So what you want to do is go ahead and loosen and remove those. That's going to allow you to go ahead and remove this out of the way and get better access to those bolts underneath the intake. Once you get those screws removed, go ahead and pull this out and set it aside. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take the bolt with the washer and we're going to get it started here, just a couple threads. And we're going to do that for all four of the lower bolts here. Now let's go ahead and lower our intake down. Now there are dowel pins on that intake that we need to drop down into position. So we're going to drop the intake down at an angle. Once it drops in, then you can tip this up. I'm going to install one of the upper bolts Thread that in a bit to hold that in place. And then I'll continue putting these bolts in all the way across the top. It's much easier doing it that way there, putting the 4 bolts in across the bottom, a few threads, and then drop the intake down onto them. Otherwise, they're really, really tough to get to once you get the top bolts in. And then you have to fish your hands underneath to try and get those lined up, and waste a lot of time doing it that way there. Okay, we have all of our bolts installed. Let's go ahead and snug those down. All right, now snug down the 2 rear bolts. Let's go ahead and snug down the 2 front lower bolts. All right, snug that down. Now we'll have had all 4 of the lower bolts snugged. Let's go ahead and do the same for the upper. And we're not going to make these super tight because we do have to come back and torque them down. On the back here, I'm using an open end wrench for clearance purposes. Now on the 2 end studs, we have the nuts on there. Let's go ahead and zip these down. Now we go ahead and torque down our exhaust manifold / intake manifold bolts. There is a particular pattern as well as torque specification. Now we're going to start with this bolt here. 1, 2, 3. So this is a triangular pattern. I'm going to come over here to 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11. Now 6 and 7 on the ends here, those are be torqued to 23 foot-pounds. All the other bolts are going to be torqued to 24 foot-pounds. Install your canister. You should have 3 screws for this here. Good, install those and snug it down. Install the vacuum solenoid here. Press it down. On the other side here, we have the vacuum hose that goes to this. We're going to plug this into the port, but just beside the throttle body. Grab our fuel line here. Bring that up into position. Now there's a red, we put a cap on this here. We're just going to let this set, but we do have to install the nut and bolt on the bottom side to that bracket to secure that fuel line. I'm going to go ahead and put our bolt in through the bracket on the bottom side of the intake. It goes through the tab for the fuel line. And you can reuse the original hardware if you want. We just sourced out some new stuff to make it go on a lot easier and faster. Just gently snug that. Doesn't have to be super tight, but you do want to make sure that it's snug. Then you come up here to that fuel line. I'm going to go ahead and pop off our cap here. And all you got to do is take the fuel line, line it up, push it in. You're going to hear it and feel it snap into place. Then you want to put on your safety latch here. There we go, and that locks the fuel line onto, from the fuel line to the fuel rail. Let's grab our harness and bring this back over here. Now don't forget, you need to run this portion of the wire harness underneath the fuel rail. We have 2 wires in the back with connectors on those. One's the crank sensor, the other one is the O2 sensor. Now that we have that harness through, we want to go ahead and attach the main wire loom or the plastic connector to the studs on the cylinder heads. So we'll line that up. Push that down into place. Now we can go ahead and install our fuel injector connectors here. All you gotta do is line those up. And once you have those lined up, just push them down and on. You're gonna feel them snap into place. Do that for all 6. All right, all the injectors are connected here. Let's go ahead and connect this batch of connectors here. And simply just going to line things up to the corresponding components and pop these together. I want to go ahead and bring our throttle cable over. And make sure that this gets installed onto the clips on top of the valve cover. Feed that through, clip it in, snap this onto the throttle body linkage, pop the cable into the guide. So throttle cable is all set. And you can pivot over this vacuum tube right here. If you want, you can run this underneath the throttle cable. Push this in. We have this vacuum hose here that goes right onto the back. Pop that into place there. On the brake booster, push this onto the port on the intake. And then to the front of the engine, up here, we have the coolant temp sensor. Push that on until you feel that snap into place. Take your power steering pump. I'll go ahead and line that up through the bracket here. Go ahead and feed that bolt through. I'm going to try and get that started. Rotate that pulley, put the other bolt in through the top. I want to go ahead and install our lower bolt. Go ahead and work the belt onto your pulleys. Make sure that they are fully seated in the grooves. Wrapped around everything properly. Now we can go ahead and tighten that down. Now what we want to look for is you want to have, in the middle of the belt, you want to have about a 1/2 inch up and down play. 1/2 inch down, 1/2 inch up. That'll be the proper tension for your belt. You don't want it to be super tight. You'll burn out the bearings in the water pump and your tensioners. So adjust accordingly. Remove the towel from the throttle body. Install your intake tube. Want to go ahead and secure the hose clamps. Use your flathead screwdriver. You want to tighten this down. Once that clamp snugs down, you're pretty much all set at that point there. You don't have to make it super, super tight, but you do want to make it snug. Do the same for the other side where the filter is at. Once you have that snug, come on back to the valve cover here. You have your vacuum port right here. Go ahead and push that into place. Let's go ahead and install our expansion tank here. We're going to drop this right down onto our radiator support. And these little tabs here are going to drop in and lock into place. Just push that in. And we want to go ahead and install the hose onto the radiator. Just line that up and push that onto the port. And then move your hose clamp over and secure that. Now on the exhaust, we want to go ahead and just pivot that off to the side. Install your exhaust donut. You can line that up with the exhaust flange. Once you have the donut on the exhaust, you want to go ahead and install the studs here. You want to go ahead and snug these down. And we want to kind of do it evenly as well. You want to watch the gasket, make sure the exhaust is good and tight. And you want to have pretty much the same amount of threads on both bolts here to make sure that it's good and evenly tightened. All right, now that we have both of these bolts tight, you can go ahead and lower the vehicle, start it up, and listen for any exhaust leaks. At that point there, you're all set.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.